The bloodshed in South Africa, next on 1 Norway Street. Welcome to 1 Norway Street from the home of the Christian Science Monitor. I'm Schuyler Sackett. Today, the dilemma of illegal immigrants in the United States and the new technology that could transform radio. But first, the violence in South Africa. Bitter factional fighting continues to rage in Natal province and the black townships around Johannesburg, threatening to derail a program of political reform aimed at scrapping apartheid. Thousands have died in 4 years of fighting between supporters of the African National Congress, headed by Nelson Mandela, and the conservative Inkk movement, led by Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Mr. Mandela and South African President F.W. de Klerk held their latest round of talks this week to discuss ways of ending the violence. But Mr. Mandela continues to refuse to meet with Chief Buthelezi. Last week, Mr. Mandela warned that South Africa could drown in blood if the government does not take immediate action to stem the fighting. Joining us to report on the situation is World Monitor correspondent Simon Marks. Thank you for joining us, Simon. What is all of the fighting between Inkk and the ANC about? What's prompting this? Well,
I think the cause of the immediate fighting has now been blurred by the history. It started back in 1986 in Natal province in the east of the country, and then it was very much a violent struggle about the way in which Natal province should be organised. Natal is very much run by Chief Buthelezi, by Inkk. Supporters of the African National Congress went in to try and recruit members, and fighting began. It's now moved up the country into the townships around Johannesburg, and as it's moved, so it's become more of a social sort of violent struggle, a vendetta in which people are avenging the deaths of friends and relatives. So the very cause of it has become blurred, but it was, to begin with, essentially a political fight between Inkk and the African National Congress.
Are there ideological differences between Inkk and the ANC?
There are. Inkk, as you said, is a conservative movement. It's very much a Zulu nationalist movement, although it's now opened its doors to all members in a similar move to the National Party's move recently. So it will take anybody, but it is effectively a conservative, Zulu-dominated right-wing organisation that believes in free market economy, that believes in the host of philosophical and ideological beliefs that conservative parties traditionally believe in. The ANC, of course, is fairly left-wing based. It has a collective leadership. Ink's leadership is very vertical, heading to Chief Buthelezi. The ANC's is very horizontal.
But does the ANC have any kind of a tribal basis comparable to Inkk?
Well, Inkk says that the ANC leadership, and indeed Mr. Mandela himself, comes from the Xhosa tribe, and there are several leading Xhosa tribesmen at the top of the ANC. But you also see whites at the head of the ANC. You see Joe Slovo, the head of the South African Communist Party, other leading white ideologues who help formulate the ANC's views on policies. That you don't see with Inkk.
Is the fighting that's been going on, and it seems to be reaching a new peak of violence in South Africa, is it strictly between the ANC and Inkk, or is there any involvement of, for example, the police in South Africa in this?
Well, that's Mr. Mandela's main claim, of course. He says that the police side with Inkk. A judicial commission recently reported on violence in Sebokeng township, which is near Johannesburg, and said that there was evidence that the police had not done all they could to try and separate the two sides. Mr. Mandela's calling for a further independent judicial commission to investigate the role not just of the South African police, but also of the KwaZulu police, which is the police force that operates in Natal province, that is effectively controlled by Chief Gatsha Buthelezi, but is notionally independent. Now, we spoke to the KwaZulu Police Commissioner, and he said, yes, a lot of my men do sympathise with Inkk. It's a popular organisation round here, and it has not been easy persuading them that they've got to take a middle line.
How is all of the violence and bloodshed affecting the push for constitutional reform in South Africa?
Well, it very much now threatens to derail progress towards full negotiations. We're at a situation now where there will be, at some stage, full all-party negotiations involving the government, the ANC, Inkk and other organisations. It is quite clearly being said by the government and indeed by the ANC and Inkk that those negotiations cannot begin while this violence takes place. So until there's some sort of peaceful resolution, the progress towards a new political settlement in South Africa remains pretty derailed.
Is all of this turmoil eroding respect for South Africa's leaders, for President de Klerk and for Nelson Mandela?
It's putting all of them in increasingly tight corners as far as their respective constituencies are concerned. The whites in South Africa want the violence to end. It's happening 5 miles from white Johannesburg. They don't like that. They want it to stop, and they want de Klerk to be able to prove to them that the reform program he embarked upon can take South Africa to a new peaceful solution. The blacks, who were waiting 27 years for Nelson Mandela to come out of jail, have now seen him free for 6 months, and they want changes in their daily lives. They're getting impatient. The blacks who support Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who waited 27 years again for Nelson Mandela to come out, watch as this man moves to the forefront of the world stage and, in a sense, takes the ground from underneath Buthelezi's feet. So they're impatient. All 3 constituencies pressuring their leaders for some sort of progress. And that's why this violence is happening, in a sense. The impatience in the townships is very great.
Simon, you've just come from South Africa. Obviously, what we see on the news is the violence, the news-making events that are happening in South Africa. But what is the general mood in the country? Are people optimistic that positive change can happen, or is there a sense of great tension in the air?
It depends where you go and when you go there. You can go into Soweto and things will be very calm and everybody will be on the streets, buying fruit in the markets, things like that. And then you can drive back an hour later and you can see scenes like we saw in the videotape at the start of the program. Things move very quickly there. In white Johannesburg suburbs, there's very great fear about a rising crime wave, but people remain fairly optimistic for the most part, and it's difficult to generalize, but people remain fairly optimistic that the outcome will be a good one for South Africa. Equally, you can talk to conservative parties supporting Afrikaners who insist that they are never going to give their land away and that whites should control South Africa and should continue to control South Africa and are fighting against what the government's doing, in many cases turning to violence to do so.
Simon, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Simon Marks is a Monitor correspondent who's been covering South Africa, and One Norway Street continues after this brief message.